Welcome back to the channel. I appreciate you being here. I want to start a brand new series today on the subjects of mental health and faith, along with a bit of my own story and some of the things that I went through and experienced as a person of faith, a pastor of a church having a significant mental health crisis. I'm old enough to have been a part of a church at a time when people who suffered with anxiety or depression, suicidal ideation, things like that, it was viewed as sin. It was viewed as a failure on your part to appropriate the peace of God and trust in Jesus. And you needed to spend more time in the Word, and you needed to pray about it and pray through it and give thanks to God. And after all, Jesus said, "Don't worry about tomorrow. Sufficient for the day is the evil thereof." And Paul said, don't be anxious for anything, but in prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and let the peace of God rule in your heart. The problem is, I had been doing all of those things, and it wasn't the solution to what I was experiencing. I had something going on up here that I could not manage, no matter how disciplined I was in the exercise and application of my faith and spiritual disciplines. This was all viewed in the churches I was a part of as a failure on your part, some sort of sin. I had been spending hours every day immersed in scripture. I was up at 4 a.m. every day reading, studying, praying, preparing, teaching, preaching. And if I wasn't doing those things, I was out in the community serving and building relationships and trying to make a difference in the towns that we lived in. And I was doing all of the things in prayer and meditation and contemplation and morning at night. And I was doing that, but I was also doing some other things too. I was a hospice chaplain, so I was covering 5 counties. And I was also a doctoral student. And I was working on clinical pastoral education units to maintain, my work as a hospice chaplain. And those units were between 400 and 800 hours, I think, of clinical pastoral education I received. So I was a busy person. In fact, I look back now and say, you know what? I was overextended. I was overburdened. I was trying to do too much. I was doing all of the things except for caring for myself. Now, if you are struggling right now and you feel like you're in a crisis, if you're here in the States, call 911. And most police departments have a crisis intervention team officer who can come out and talk with you in a non-threatening way and help de-escalate that situation and get you to people that can help you. You can also contact the National Suicide Hotline, and I will leave the numbers in the description box in this video for you. The most expensive advice I've ever received in my life was free advice from people that were unqualified, people that did not have the capacity to understand, the concern to understand, or the ability to relate to my experience. And I'm talking specifically about pastors. I was one. I still fill in from time to time. I know that the typical course of study for people that attend seminary and Bible college to prepare for ministry, their typical course of study is Bible, theology, interpretation, exegesis, Greek, Hebrew, sometimes Latin. All of those things are wonderful, but it hardly qualifies a person to address serious issues of mental illness that could impact that person and that person's family for years to come. And so if you are struggling and suffering, the best thing you could possibly do for yourself right now is go and seek qualified, professional, competent help from somebody who has the capacity, the willingness, and the skill sets to relate to you and understand what you're going through and help you on a path to recovery and wholeness. It's the best thing I've ever done for myself, was go and get help when I needed it. But I didn't do it the first time. I've had 2 significant mental health crises since 2007. The first one, I was feeling very, very defeated. I was extraordinarily depressed. I was anxious. I was upset. I had all kinds of emotions going on at the time. I felt like a failure in many regards. And I remember going to the VA for a routine checkup, and while you're there, they're checking your blood pressure, your temperature, your pulse, your O2 levels, and they're asking you screening questions like, are you depressed right now? I decided that day I was going to say, yes, I am. I feel very depressed, and I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do anymore. I'm doing everything everybody had always taught me was the right thing to do if you are a Christian. And it wasn't working. I went to go speak with my doctor, and my doctor had, at the end of the meeting with her, asked me, well, how are you feeling? And I said, I feel defeated. I feel depressed. I feel ashamed. I'm suffering. I've never felt this low in my life. I don't even want to live. And she says, before you leave, you need to go to the mental health clinic. I've already arranged for you to speak with somebody there. Do not leave this hospital before you go and talk to somebody. So I thought, you know what? I do need the help. I'm going to go do it. So I mustered up the courage and I started my journey downstairs to the first floor. And as I approached, I saw the sign on the wall, mental health clinic. And I went into a panic. I thought, you know what? I can't afford to have a mental health crisis. I can't afford the social capital of a mental health crisis. I have mentors and people in the church, and what are they going to think? And those kind of things were always viewed as a failure on your part to appropriate the peace of God. It was viewed as sin. If you worried about anything, you were sinning. If you were depressed, you were sinning. It was a failure on your part to just stand in the joy of the Lord and stand on the promises of God. And you weren't praying enough, and you weren't reading the Bible enough, and you weren't doing this or that enough. And it was always viewed as a failure. And I thought, these people aren't going to understand. I don't think they're going to understand. And I just couldn't afford the social capital. So I kept on walking. I'm like, these folks are not going to put me in a jacket. There was so much stigma associated with having a crisis at the time going on in my mind. They're not going to put me in a jacket, and I'm not going on a 96-hour hold. And I walked out of the hospital, went to my car, and I left just as defeated and depressed as I've ever been. And I continued to suffer for 8 more years until I had my second significant mental health crisis in 2015. Now, that particular mental health crisis, there was a lot of variables that contributed to that. Number one, I was overburdened and overextended. I was doing all of the things that I was supposed to be doing as a Christian, as a pastor, except for taking care of myself. I was pastoring full time. I was working as a hospice chaplain. I covered 5 counties. I was doing on-call work. I was a doctoral student. I was also taking clinical pastoral education units that were between 400 and 800 hours. And I had intended on becoming a board certified chaplain. My clinical pastoral education supervisor in our one-on-ones told me one day, he said, Mike, you are headed for catastrophe. You are running headlong into disaster, and it's going to be horrible if you don't make some changes and do it right now. Of course, I didn't really take him serious because I felt pretty good about everything I was doing. I was active, I was making a difference, I was in the Word every day, but I was also suffering quite a bit of vicarious traumatization. I started to experience compassion fatigue and burnout. While I felt good in one hand and felt joyful about the work I was doing because I thought it was very meaningful work, I was also burning out and getting sick of all of it. He saw the handwriting on the wall. I didn't take it serious, and I ended up in a big disaster. And it was coupled with a lot of different elements that contributed to that. I had harmed people in the process of my spiraling and deconstruction, which I'm going to cover in another video. I'm going to talk about deconstruction of faith. Didn't give up everything, but I did give up certain doctrines and dogmas that I was taught to believe that couldn't survive basic inquiry and responsible interpretation. And that was hard. That was a factor. I was no longer compatible with the church from a doctrinal standpoint. I was suffering an extraordinary mental health crisis, so I was not mentally and emotionally capable of being present and joyful in the work any longer. I wanted to die. I had harmed people in the process that I never intended to harm. I'd done things that betrayed everything I'd ever taught, everything I'd ever believed, and I caused a lot of harm and a lot of hurt to people that I deeply care about, people I think about all day long. I didn't even like harming bugs. Like, I would pick a bug up and take it outside because I'm thinking, you know what? They want to live just like I do. It was just not in my nature to cause harm. And isn't that like one of the basic rules of being a decent human being is don't cause any harm? Why cause some harm? And so I had all of this shame attached with a mental health crisis. And I was contemplating suicide. I had a plan and I had the means to do it. I wound up going back to the VA. I resigned on a Sunday, practically begging for ongoing friendship and support from people. I thought our friendships and relationships were strong enough to transcend my doctrinal incompatibility with them. We had gone on vacations together. We had celebrated successes and mourned losses, and I baptized their kids and their family, and many of them. We had enjoyed each other very much over the years, but when I was no longer compatible doctrinally with the church and I wasn't useful to them as a pastor, those relationships dissolved. In spite of my plea, I was practically begging for ongoing support. I didn't hear from anybody for about 6 months, and when I did, it wasn't a pleasant conversation. And for 2 years, I stewed in anger and bitterness and rage and resentment against these people because I thought we had a friendship that would transcend those doctrinal differences, a relationship that was strong enough to see another suffering person through their crisis, but as it turned out, it wasn't. I didn't learn for a few years after that event that the people that loved me really did love me. They loved my family. They didn't know how to help me. I had met with one of my close friends at the time that I enjoyed very much. A few years after this resignation, and I was like, where were you guys? I needed you. What happened? He said, Mike, this is on me. He said, we thought the best thing we could give you, given everything you shared with us in your last sermon, was space and time. And none of us were prepared to see you in the condition that you were in, and none of us knew how to help you. All of a sudden, I wasn't so angry anymore. They were doing the best they could at the time. I hope during this series that I can encourage you to go to some people that can help you. Because I've learned that had I checked out in 2015 like I had planned, like I wanted to do, I would have missed out on 8 and soon to be 9, maybe 10 grandkids. My first grandson wasn't born until 2017. And these kids are the absolute joy of my life. You don't know what tomorrow may bring your way, what good fortune may come your way. There's always reason to hope. And your mind is lying to you, trying to convince you that the people in the world would be better off if they never heard from you or saw your face again. That's a lie. Sometimes they just don't know what to do to help you. So I hope you'll stay tuned because I have so much more to share, and I want to talk about how I survived, how I coped, the processes that I went through, the therapies that I sought, the medications that I used, and some of those other experiences, as well as my journey back into a faith community. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you found this helpful, if you don't feel alone and ashamed any longer, because you see another human being that was very much like you, a person of faith and commitment, a person who had been taught to believe that those kind of things were sinful, but I no longer say those things, a person who did all of the things and still suffered. If you no longer feel alone because of me, I'm grateful. I appreciate you joining me. Leave me a like, leave me a comment, interact with me. I would love to hear from you. Feel free to subscribe, share the story if you find it helpful. And again, go to somebody that's competent and capable of helping you, who has the skill sets to do so. All right, until next time, thanks for joining.